The doctor looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. Her hands were shaking. She told me I needed to leave my husband and file for divorce immediately. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I remember feeling oddly calm, like my body decided to shut down every unnecessary emotion to survive the next few minutes. I asked her why. She didn't answer at first. She turned the monitor slightly away, stood up, and asked the nurse to step outside. Then she leaned in close and said, very quietly, "There's no time to explain. You'll understand when you see this. I'm glad you're here. Truly. Because what happened after that appointment is something I carried alone for years, and I've learned that silence protects the wrong people. One image, one line on a screen, one decision that changed my marriage, my pregnancy, and the way I understand trust. This isn't a story about a cheating husband in the way people usually think. It's worse than that. And the ultrasound wasn't about the baby. At the time, I was 34 years old, living in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, married for 7 years, pregnant with what I believed was our first child. I worked as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm. My husband, Daniel, was an insurance adjuster. Numbers guy. Calm. Dependable. The kind of man people describe as solid. That word mattered to me. Solid. Predictable. Safe. The ultrasound was supposed to be routine. 20 minutes. Gel on my stomach. Grainy black and white images. A heartbeat. Maybe a printed photo to tape on the fridge. Daniel had texted me that morning. Wish I could be there. Big meeting. Take pics. I didn't question it. He missed appointments sometimes. Life happens. The tech had been quiet, but not unusually so. Focused. Clicking measurements. Typing numbers. I watched the ceiling tiles and tried to relax my shoulders. I remember thinking about lunch. About whether I'd stop for groceries on the way home. Then she froze. She zoomed in. Adjusted contrast. Measured again. Her jaw tightened. She excused herself and said she needed to get the doctor. That part didn't panic me. I'd been on message boards. I knew they sometimes double-checked things. What I didn't expect was the doctor's face when she walked in. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't smile. She looked at the screen for less than 10 seconds before her expression changed completely. That's when her hands started shaking. She asked me if my husband was with me. I said no. She nodded once and said, "That's probably for the best." That sentence didn't make sense at the time. I didn't understand it then. She asked how long I'd been married, how long we'd been trying to conceive, whether my husband had any medical conditions I knew about. Her questions felt oddly specific. Too specific. Then she said the words that replayed in my head for years. You need to protect yourself. I laughed, softly, because it sounded dramatic. Like something out of a medical show. I said, "From what?" She didn't answer. She turned the screen back toward me and pointed to a small, bright shape I hadn't noticed before. "That," she said, "is not what you think it is." I leaned forward. I squinted. I asked her to explain. She shook her head and said, "If you leave here and go straight home, you'll talk yourself out of this." Then she reached into a folder, pulled out a single printed page, and placed it face down on my lap. I didn't turn it over right away. What I found next didn't just change my pregnancy. It changed who had control in my marriage. And I didn't even know I was being controlled yet. Before I begin, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if stories like this stay with you, please like and subscribe. It really helps me keep sharing the truths I've carried for years. Before that ultrasound, my life looked ordinary in a way I was proud of. Daniel and I lived in a beige 2-story house on a cul-de-sac where everyone waved but rarely stopped to talk. Mortgage paid on time. 2 cars, both mid-range sedans. No flashy vacations, no dramatic arguments. Our biggest fights were about groceries and whether the lawn needed mowing again. We met in 2013 at a friend's engagement party. He was quiet, polite, the kind of man who asked questions and actually waited for the answers. I liked that. I dated men who filled silence with themselves. Daniel didn't. He listened. When we married 2 years later, People said things like, "You chose well, and he'll take care of you." I believed that. I still believe that's what he wanted me to believe. We kept separate checking accounts but shared a savings account. That was his suggestion. Cleaner, he said. Less stress. He handled insurance paperwork, taxes, anything involving forms. I handled scheduling, home repairs, birthdays, family communication. It worked. Or at least it looked like it worked. Trying for a baby had been methodical. Ovulation apps, timed calendars, one fertility consultation after 8 months that ended with, "Everything looks fine. Just give it time." Daniel acted supportive. He came to that appointment, held my hand, paid the copay. When I finally got the positive test, he hugged me for a long time. Longer than usual. He said, "This changes everything," in a way that sounded serious, not joyful. I didn't question it. Big moments make people reflective. Looking back, that sentence matters more than I understood then. During the first trimester, Daniel became quieter. Not distant, just efficient. He asked practical questions. Costs, insurance coverage, delivery hospitals. He made spreadsheets. That was his personality, I told myself. He insisted we switch health insurance plans during open enrollment. Said it would cover more. I didn't read the details. I trusted him. He worked in insurance. "This is literally my job," he said, smiling. There were little things I noticed but dismissed. He started locking his phone, face down. He stopped asking how appointments went. He discouraged me from telling people too early. "Let's wait until the anatomy scan," he said. I told myself he was cautious, responsible, solid. The day of the ultrasound, I didn't tell him I was nervous. I didn't tell him the doctor looked afraid. I didn't tell him I was holding a piece of paper in my lap that I hadn't read yet. I drove home instead of stopping for groceries. I remember gripping the steering wheel too tightly. My hands hurt. When I got home, Daniel was already there. That surprised me. His car was in the driveway. He was supposed to be at work. He stood up when I walked in and asked, "How'd it go?" I said, "Fine," because that's what wives say when they don't yet know how much truth costs. He smiled and said, "Good." That was the first moment something felt wrong. Not the ultrasound, not the shaking hands, not even the doctor's warning. It was the way he didn't ask a single follow-up question. I didn't understand it then, but that silence was a red flag I wouldn't be able to unsee. And the paper in my purse hadn't even been unfolded yet. That night, after dinner, I went to the bathroom and locked the door. That alone should have told me something was wrong. I had never locked the bathroom door in my own house before. Not once in 7 years of marriage. But my body did it without asking my permission, like it knew something my mind was still avoiding. I sat on the edge of the tub and took the folded paper out of my purse. It was a preliminary report, not written for patients. Clinical language, codes, abbreviations. I recognized some from earlier appointments. Others were unfamiliar. I read it once without understanding much. I read it a second time more slowly. Then I saw the phrase the doctor had circled in blue ink. Non-viable gestation, inconsistent findings. My stomach dropped, but that wasn't the part that confused me. Miscarriages happen. I knew that. I'd prepared myself emotionally for that possibility since the day I saw the positive test. What didn't make sense was the line below it. Presence of foreign implant material detected. I read that line 5 times. Foreign, implant, material. I sat there staring at the paper, my mind cycling through explanations that didn't require my life to collapse. Medical error. Wrong chart. Technical glitch. Something benign that sounded worse than it was. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I felt suspended, like time had paused while my brain tried to build a bridge between what I was reading and what I knew to be true. Daniel knocked on the door. "Everything okay?" he asked. His voice sounded normal. Too normal. I folded the paper quickly and said yes. He told me dessert was in the fridge. Cheesecake. He'd stopped on the way home. Another surprise. I flushed the toilet even though I hadn't used it and washed my hands longer than necessary. At dinner, he talked about work. A claim dispute. A long call with underwriting. I nodded. I smiled when expected. I asked questions at the right moments. He never mentioned the ultrasound again. That night, he fell asleep quickly. I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, counting it. In for 4, out for 6, like I was trying to memorize something before it disappeared. At 2:14 a.m., I picked up my phone and searched the phrase from the report. Foreign implant material ultrasound. The results weren't reassuring. Medical journals, case studies, forums I'd never visited before. Words like device, insert, tampering. I stopped reading when my chest started to tighten. At 3:02 a.m., I noticed something else. My health insurance app had a notification. An explanation of benefits had been posted earlier that day. That was unusual. Imaging claims usually took weeks. The provider name wasn't my EBS office. It was a private diagnostic lab in another county. I clicked into the details. The service date matched my ultrasound appointment. The billing code didn't. It was listed as specialized imaging review, third party. I didn't understand it then, but I knew one thing. I hadn't authorized any third-party review. In the morning, Daniel made coffee like always. Black. No sugar. He set my mug in front of me and kissed my forehead. "You okay?" he asked. I said, "I didn't sleep well." He nodded and said, "Pregnancy does that." That sentence stayed with me, because later that afternoon, I called the lab listed on the claim. I told myself I was just asking a question. Just clarifying a billing error. The woman on the phone put me on hold for a long time. When she came back, her voice was careful. She asked me to verify my identity again. Then she said, the request for secondary review came from the policy holder. I said, "That's me." There was a pause. Then she said, "No, the request came from your spouse." I didn't understand it then. But that was the first crack in the version of my marriage I trusted, and I still had no idea what he'd asked them to look for. After that phone call, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't even look at him differently that night. That surprises people when I tell this story. They ask why I didn't explode, why I didn't demand answers immediately. The truth is simpler and less dramatic. I didn't yet know what I was standing on. I could feel the ground shifting, but I hadn't seen the drop. I needed facts, not reassurance, not explanations. Facts. The next morning, while Daniel showered, I opened our shared laptop. He used it occasionally for work when his office computer ran slow. He trusted it. I knew because the browser still remembered his passwords. I told myself I was just checking insurance documents. That's how it starts. A reasonable excuse that keeps you calm. I searched his email for the name of the lab. 3 results appeared, all from the same week. The first was a confirmation email, secondary diagnostic imaging request received. The second was an invoice. The third was a PDF attachment titled Review Parameters. I opened the PDF. It wasn't medical advice. It wasn't a concern about fetal health. It was a list, bullet points, specific instructions, confirm presence of implanted foreign object. Assess placement consistency. Flag any deviation from expected gestational anatomy. My hands went cold. There was a signature line at the bottom. Daniel's full legal name, his policy number, and a timestamp from 3 days before my ultrasound. That wasn't the worst part. Attached to that email thread was another message, forwarded from an address I didn't recognize. No name, just letters and numbers. The subject line read, "Per our agreement." The body contained one sentence. "If confirmed, proceed with next phase." No explanation, no emotion, just instruction. I sat there staring at the screen while the shower ran upstairs. I remember thinking, very calmly, this isn't about a baby. I closed the laptop when I heard the water turn off. That afternoon, I called my IBS office and asked to speak directly to the doctor. I didn't explain why. I just said it was urgent. They scheduled me for the following morning. That night, Daniel suggested we go over baby names. He had a list on his phone. He said, "Just to feel normal again." I nodded and listened while he read names out loud. He never noticed I didn't respond. At the appointment the next day, the doctor didn't sugarcoat anything. She shut the door, sat across from me, and asked if my husband knew I was there. I said no. She exhaled slowly and said, "Then I'm going to speak plainly." She explained that what they'd seen on the ultrasound was not a natural anomaly. It was a small medical-grade implant, inserted prior to conception. Not common, not accidental, designed to interfere with early pregnancy viability. She used words like experimental and off-label. She told me it was often marketed as a reversible fertility management option in certain cycles. I asked her who would have had access. She looked at me carefully and said, "Someone you trusted." I asked her why she told me to get a divorce. She said, "Because this wasn't about health. It was about control." Then she told me something I still hear in her voice sometimes. "This was planned. And if you stay, it won't stop here." Before I left, she printed my full records. Not summaries, everything. Imaging notes, review logs, access history. One page showed when the implant was first visible in imaging. 8 months earlier, 2 months before we started trying for a baby. That timing broke something in me. I drove home in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. I parked in the driveway and sat there with the engine off, holding a stack of papers that proved my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. Inside, Daniel was on a work call. I could hear him through the open window. Calm, professional, the same voice he used with me. I didn't go inside right away. I sat there and realized something terrifying. If I hadn't gone to that ultrasound, if the doctor hadn't noticed, I would have spent years blaming my body. And the man who did this would have been the one comforting me. That was the lowest point. Because in that moment, I understood I wasn't just betrayed. I had been managed. And I didn't know yet how far he'd already gone. I didn't go inside the house right away. I sat in my car until my phone vibrated with a low battery warning. 23 minutes. I know because later I checked the timestamp on a photo I took of the paperwork, just to make sure it existed. Just to make sure I wasn't losing my grip on reality. When I finally walked in, Daniel was in the kitchen, laptop open, tie loosened. He looked up and smiled. "You're back early," he said. I said, "The appointment was quick." That was the last easy lie I told him. That night, I didn't sleep. But I wasn't spiraling anymore. Something had shifted. The fear had burned itself out and left behind something colder and more useful. Clarity. I stopped asking why and started asking how much. Over the next week, I became observant in a way I never had before. Not suspicious. Methodical. I watched patterns. I took notes on my phone and labeled them boring things like grocery list so I wouldn't forget where I hid them. I requested my full insurance history online. Not summaries. Raw logs. Downloads with dates, IP addresses, and access points. It took 2 days for approval. When it came through, the picture sharpened. Daniel had accessed my policy information 17 times in 6 months. He'd authorized consultations I never attended. He'd paid for them from a checking account I didn't recognize. I searched the routing number. It belonged to a private financial services firm in Delaware. That's when I understood this wasn't impulsive. It was structured. I checked our shared savings account. Nothing unusual. That was intentional. The unfamiliar account never touched our household finances. Clean separation. No accidental overlap. One night, while he showered, I checked his phone. I didn't scroll aimlessly. I went straight to the apps list. A secure messaging app one didn't recognize. A file vault app disguised as a calculator. And a calendar app that wasn't synced to his main one. Inside the vault were PDFs, contracts, timelines. One folder was labeled contingencies. Another was labeled compliance. I didn't open everything. I didn't need to. I understood enough. One document referenced me as Subject A. Another listed projected outcomes over a 5-year period. Fertility outcomes, emotional response projections, financial risk assessments. My name appeared only once, next to a number. I closed the app and put the phone back exactly where it had been. That night, Daniel touched my stomach absent-mindedly while we watched television. He said, "We'll figure this out." I said nothing. Because here's the truth. By then, I wasn't figuring anything out anymore. I was deciding. I called a lawyer 2 days later. Not a divorce lawyer. A civil litigation attorney with experience in medical consent violations. I didn't give details at first. I just asked if what I was describing sounded hypothetical. He listened quietly and then said, "No. That sounds deliberate." I asked what I needed. He said, "Documentation, patience, and to not tip your hand." So I didn't. I stopped acting distant. I stopped asking questions. I stopped reacting. I cooked dinner. I laughed at the right moments. I let Daniel believe the ultrasound scare had softened me. That I was fragile. That I needed him. He told me, "You should be grateful I handle things," one evening, casually. I nodded. Inside, I repeated that sentence and started carefully. Because the moment you understand someone thinks they own the process, you understand exactly how to take it back. By the end of that week, I had copied everything. Emails, logs, PDFs, screenshots, timestamped backups uploaded to 2 cloud accounts he didn't know existed. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready, and he still had no idea what was coming. I chose the timing carefully. Tuesday, 6:42 p.m. 2 weeks after the ultrasound. Daniel liked predictability. Tuesdays were predictable. No late meetings. Leftovers for dinner. One episode of whatever series we were half watching. He believed nothing important ever happened on a Tuesday. That mattered. I asked him to sit down at the kitchen table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't frame it as a conversation. I said, "I need you to listen for a few minutes." He smiled and said, "You're scaring me." I didn't respond. I slid my phone across the table and unlocked it. On the screen was a folder. Dates in chronological order. File names that matched his. I started with the smallest thing first. That was intentional. "The insurance claim," I said. "The third-party review you requested." He blinked once. He said, "That's just paperwork." I waited. I opened the next file. The PDF with the review parameters. I turned the phone so he could read it himself. I watched his eyes move across the screen. I said, "You authorized this 3 days before my appointment." He leaned back slightly, crossed his arms, a defensive posture he didn't realize he had. "You're misunderstanding," he said. "I was trying to protect us." I didn't argue. I opened the access logs, highlighted entries, IP addresses, times. 17 times, I said. "That's how often you access my policy without me." His jaw tightened. I opened the photo of the medical records, the page showing first visibility, the date circled in red. 8 months ago, I said, "before we tried." That was when his composure cracked. He stood up and said my name sharply, like I was a child near a road. "You shouldn't have gone digging," he said. I said, "Sit down." He didn't expect that. Saturday. I opened the secure messaging screenshot, the email that read per our agreement. I didn't explain it. I let him see it. For the first time in our marriage, he didn't speak immediately. When he did, his voice was low, controlled. "You don't understand the context," he said. "This was complicated. You should be grateful." There it was again. I slid the final document across the table, the one labeled Outcomes, Subject A. I said, "You don't get to contextualize consent." He went pale. I stood up then, not to intimidate him, to end it. "I've already spoken to an attorney," I said. "I've given copies of everything to my doctor. And tomorrow, I'm filing a formal complaint with the medical board and my insurance provider." He laughed once. "Sure. Sharp. You think that's going to do anything?" he asked. I looked at him and said, "It already has." Then I told him the part I'd saved for last. "I know about the firm in Delaware," I said. "I know about the account. And I know this wasn't just you." That was the moment the power fully shifted. He stood up too fast, knocked his chair over. "You can't prove intent," he said. "This will ruin us. This will ruin you." I said, "No, it ruins your plan." I picked up my bag from the counter, the one I'd packed that morning. Documents inside. Clothes for 3 days. A charger. I'm leaving tonight, I said. You're not coming with me. And if you contact me again, it will be through my lawyer. He said my name like a warning. I walked past him. At the door, I turned back once. This ends now, I said, and it ends with you exposed. That was the irreversible action. Because once you say those words out loud, once they are heard, there is no pretending the marriage still exists. I didn't look back after that, and the consequences started faster than even I expected. I stayed with my sister for 3 weeks. She lived 42 miles away, in a small townhouse near Dayton, close enough to my job that I didn't have to explain anything to my manager beyond, I'm dealing with a medical issue. That sentence covered everything and invited no questions. People respect medical privacy in a way they don't respect personal boundaries. Those first few days were quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. No footsteps in the hallway. No low hum of Daniel's laptop at night. No careful monitoring of my tone or timing. I slept on a pull-out couch with a thin blanket and felt safer there than I had in my own bed. Daniel tried to contact me twice. The first time was a text, "We need to talk like adults." The second was an email, sent at 3:11 a.m., "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." I forwarded both to my attorney and didn't respond. 2 days later, my insurance provider called me directly. Not customer service. Their internal compliance department. They referenced a case number. They asked if I was in a safe place. They told me my policy access had been temporarily locked pending investigation. That call lasted 19 minutes. By the end of it, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of being believed without having to persuade anyone. The medical board followed within the week. They requested copies of everything I had. Imaging logs, authorization records, provider communications. They used words like serious breach and non-consensual intervention. They did not use Daniel's name, but they didn't need to. The pattern spoke for itself. The pregnancy ended quietly. No emergency, no dramatic scene. Just a follow-up appointment, a procedure, and paperwork that listed the loss in neutral language. I didn't tell many people. I didn't need condolences that came packaged with confusion. I needed privacy. Daniel moved out of the house voluntarily once the formal complaint was filed. His attorney advised it. I learned that through my lawyer, not from him. The house went on the market 3 months later. It sold in 11 days. Financially, the damage was contained. The unfamiliar account was frozen. The firm in Delaware cut ties quickly. Quietly, they refunded nothing. They denied involvement. That, too, was telling. Some people drifted away. A mutual friend asked me, "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" I didn't answer. Others stayed without asking for explanations. My sister, 2 co-workers, a neighbor I barely knew who dropped off soup without a note. I learned who required a narrative and who didn't. Daniel never apologized. His last message, sent through attorneys, included the line, "No harm was intended." That sentence meant nothing to me by then. What mattered was that the control was gone. The structure he built around my body, my choices, my future, it collapsed under its own documentation. He had believed precision would protect him. Instead, it recorded everything. A year later, I signed the final divorce papers in a quiet office with beige walls and a clock that ticked too loudly. I walked out alone. I felt tired, lighter, older in a way that felt earned. I didn't get justice in the dramatic sense. I got something better. I got my agency back. And for the first time since that ultrasound, I slept without listening for someone else's breathing. That wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of his control over it. People sometimes ask what stayed with me the longest after everything ended. They expect me to say the betrayal, or the pregnancy, or the shock of realizing the person I trusted most had treated my body like a variable in a plan. But that isn't it. What stayed with me was how quiet the truth was once it surfaced. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no cinematic justice, just documents, timelines, decisions. In the months after the divorce was finalized, I moved into a small apartment with creaky floors and too much afternoon light. I bought furniture slowly. I learned what silence sounded like when it wasn't loaded. I noticed how often I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. I didn't rush into telling this story. For a long time, I wondered if saying it out loud would give it more power than it deserved. But I learned something important. Silence doesn't make something disappear. It just makes it harder to recognize when it happens to someone else. There were moments when I questioned myself, not about what happened, but about whether I'd done the right thing by acting instead of minimizing. Those doubts usually arrived late at night, when everything else was quiet. Then I'd remember the doctor's hands shaking, the phrase foreign implant material, the date on that record, months before I consented to try for a child, and the doubts would pass. I don't hate Daniel. That surprises people too. Hate requires emotional engagement. What I feel now is distance. Clear, intentional distance. The kind that comes from understanding someone completely and choosing not to keep them in your life. I don't think he woke up one morning wanting to be cruel. I think he believed he was entitled to decide outcomes. That belief is quieter than malice and far more dangerous. If you're listening to this and something in your life feels managed instead of shared, I want you to pay attention to that feeling. Control rarely announces itself. It presents as efficiency, as care, as someone handling things for you. That's how it gets close. I rebuilt my life without urgency. I didn't replace what I lost. I examined it. I understood it. And then I moved forward without carrying it with me. I tell this story now because there was a version of me who needed to hear it, before a doctor had to say the words out loud. And if this reaches someone who needs that clarity sooner, then the years of silence were worth breaking. Did you like my story? Please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far this story of mine travels. Moral: control disguised as care is still control, and recognizing it is the first act of freedom.